about leadership. And so with that, I'm going to start my presentation with the fact that I spent 17 years in the Marine Corps. And during that time period, if you had asked me if I thought that I was the epitome of a leader, I would say absolutely not. In fact, I could name 100 different people who were much better leaders than me. I was surrounded by phenomenal people, and every time I would think about my own qualities and the things that made me who I was and all of my accomplishments, none of them ever seemed to compare to the people that I was comparing myself to. And so when you start to do that, leadership becomes very difficult. And so there are lots of characteristics of leadership. The common thoughts of leadership kind of represent, common thoughts of leadership kind of looks like this. A person standing in front of a crowd, giving orders and speaking to a lot of people. And that's what I initially thought when I thought leadership. During the Global Leadership Summit, we had one of the speakers talk about a pound on the table kind of leader. Someone who made their personality known, and that to me was what I knew of leadership. A lot of the leaders that stood out in my head were those people who had extreme command presence, and they would walk in and they would own everything, and everything was theirs. And if they said jump, you didn't even ask how high. You just started jumping and trying to prove to them that you were worthy. I saw on Facebook recently what leadership is, and it was kind of a joke, but essentially it talked about this, and it was like the Marine Corps leadership is, as a private, you and your entire platoon are given broth, and you're given a fork and a spoon and a knife and told to eat the broth. Well, your first sergeant stands up and says, "We're going to use the fork," and so everybody says, "Okay," and they grab the fork and they start eating the broth, even though you grew up eating broth. You know how to eat broth. You know it's the spoon, and you try to tell them, but they don't listen to you because the first sergeant said, "Use broth. Use the fork." And so that sounds to me very frustrating, and it doesn't exactly sound like leadership. But those are some common perceptions of leadership. Well, this last week we talked about the most adequate leader who has ever roamed the earth, and that is Jesus. And we talked about how he is the epitome of servant leadership, and how he didn't micromanage. In fact, instead he would teach and then send off, empowering his teams, his disciples. And that is what everyone looks to as the most adequate leader. Now, others have lots of definitions of leadership. The Marine Corps has the JJD did type buckle, which I used to be able to rattle it off really, really well. It's judgment and justice and decisiveness, integrity, discipline. So tact, initiative, enthusiasm, bearing, I always get that one, unselfishness, courage, knowledge, loyalty, and enthusiasm. And then there's, of course, the 14 leadership principles, and we're not going to go into all of them because, well, there's a lot. But that's what people look at in the Marine Corps, and that's what defines a leader, are those traits. Well, the Kununu blog had 21 different traits that they considered a leader. And again, they were very similar. There were resilience and transparency and humility, emotional aptitude, passion, integrity, vision. And then you look at Forbes. Forbes writes about, and they list the most powerful companies in the world, and their definition of leadership: enthusiasm, integrity, communication skills, loyalty, decisiveness, confidence. Now I can go down this entire list of different organizations, bloggers and writers and people who are considered the epitome of leadership. And each one of them have phenomenal lists. The problem with those lists to me is that sometimes they can cause you to feel like you're not a leader because you look at those lists and you say, I can't possibly do all of those things. And so I propose to you the most unlikely leader. Now, we don't necessarily know her name. We know that the action took place in Bethany. Some believe that it was Mary, Martha's sister. Others say that it was a prostitute. Some say a sinner. But ultimately, I believe that this woman showed some of the most incredible leadership. And the thing is, she didn't meet a lot of those qualities and traits that are listed by Forbes and by the Marine Corps and by other standards. Now, Jesus is the epitome of leadership, but I don't know, I can't necessarily relate to him sometimes because, well, he's perfection, and well, perfection is very hard to relate to, especially when you're imperfect and late all the time, or don't properly plan, or don't know everything like he does. But I can relate to her a lot more. I can relate to the fact that everybody knew her business. Everybody knew what was wrong with her. Everybody knew. I mean, in the Bible, she's listed 4 times. 4 times she's mentioned, and her actions are mentioned 4 times. And that, to me, is incredible that God thought it's so important to list her actions 4 times. She's the one. She's the one that decided that she was so overwhelmed by what God had done for her, what Jesus had done for her. You know, he'd freed her of her sins, and she had chosen to follow him. And with that, I believe that she showed 4 distinctive characteristics that I believe are inherent of leaders, and it's not necessarily her communication skills, because she didn't communicate with her mouth. She did communicate with her actions, and she had a desire to serve. A lot of people question this. You know, Judas, Pastor Kevin talked about him today, about how he was in charge of the money, and he looked at her perfume, expensive perfume, her nard, which I found out today smells kind of like patchouli in its earthy smell. She had a pound of it. That's a lot. That's a lot. 5 ounces right now is a going rate of about $40. That was 5 ounces now. So I can't even imagine what a pound would go for. So that's a lot. She had courage because, well, there were men in this room who knew her story. And again, I don't know if it's Martha's sister Mary or if it was a different person that not everybody is completely sure. John says that it was Mary, but they knew her story. It took a lot of courage for her to get up there and to do what she did. It also took humility, and all I could think is, I know what it means to feel inadequate, and I know what it means to feel completely overcome and overwhelmed by emotions. And she demonstrated her desire to show love to Jesus, and by that she also showed conviction, which is incredible to me. With that, though, one of the interesting things I learned, if you'll have a seat, one of the things that I learned as I was looking, so in my research, I found that in several of the verses, it says that she used her tears to wash the feet of Jesus. And all you could think is, well, how could she possibly use tears? Tears are few. There's, even on my worst days and my biggest grief, I don't think I could possibly pour out enough tears to wash your feet. But what I read was that in Roman days, they would actually collect their tears in a jar, and they were considered precious items. And they would, when they grieved, when they mourned, they would collect them and they would keep them. And so when it says that she poured out her tears and washed Jesus' feet, she was pouring out her grief and her pain and her suffering in the way that Jesus does to us and takes away all of those things. She poured it out in the same way that Jesus takes and pours out his love for us. Now, in other verses, in different versions of the verses, it says that she broke the jar, and in some instances it says poured on Jesus' head, and in other instances it says that she poured it out on his feet. And that the smell of the oil consumed the room, and all I can think is, well, this oil smell consumes the room, and it's only a very little amount. I told you 0.5 ounces. It's not a whole lot, and it's still, you can smell it from throughout the room. So you can imagine all of the men that were sitting around this table, or reclining at table, which is on the floor. So reclining at table with oil smelling and perfuming the room, how overwhelming this situation must have been. But what's more incredible about this situation is the fact that she took down her hair, which from what I've read is actually not something done because it's considered too casual and too close and too much. But she didn't just let down her hair, she took her hair and she used it to clean and wash Jesus' feet, which is an intimate action that, for some was considered too much. But she used that instance and that action to get very close and to humble herself and to show humility. And to me, that is an overwhelming way of showing servant leadership. So that is it. That is my informational presentation, is that a lot of times we look to Jesus because he is a phenomenal leader. But sometimes it's hard to relate to him. But I am so grateful to God that he puts other instances of leadership that are a little bit more relatable for people like me.